1,000,000 voices.
Hi, I'm Catia, and this is 1 Million Voices, where inspirational speakers share their stories and champion organizations that are making a difference in the world. I think we are living in a very complex world, in a sense that there is a bombardment of information coming from so many different sources all the time. And, with social media and people forwarding messages constantly, and people get confused. And also, the whole debate over fake news and a lot of people not really trusting journalists at the moment. So what would you say, Clarissa, to people who are watching us right now, and are thinking, what can I do and what should I do to actually make sure that I'm getting information from a reliable source? And also, what would you say to young journalists in particular, and also students who are facing this new environment, and what can they do as well to make sure, the journalism, still has its role in the world, and they are doing that job in a way that, people can trust as well, journalists, because I think there is this whole mistrust that is going on.
Yeah, I think this is, when I talk to young journalists, this is a big part of the conversation, because I think the challenge that they face is a formidable one, which is the crisis of faith in mainstream media and the crisis of faith in journalism and in the service that journalists provide, which I fundamentally believe is a vital service that is in the interests of every healthy, thriving society to support. I also understand how we sort of got to this place, and a big part of it is the Pandora's box of social media that has been opened. A big part of that is the willful spreading of misinformation. And so what do we do as journalists to counter that? Do we respond to every criticism that we receive? Do we try to fight back, to defend ourselves? There isn't an obvious good answer that neatly deals with the problem. I tend to advise people to tune out the noise and focus on the facts. Facts are your friend. Keep telling stories that are rooted in truth and factuality, and you can't go wrong. As Scott Pelley, who is, the great 60 Minutes correspondent, once told me, nobody's going to remember who got it first, Clarissa, but everybody remembers who got it wrong. So as journalists, it's more important than ever right now that we don't get things wrong, that we take the extra few hours or few days to corroborate our story or to corroborate a source, and to make sure that we have got it right. We now more than ever, I think, have a particularly vital service to provide. And I do think it'll swing back in our favor. I think the other thing that people misunderstand about disinformation and the goal of disinformation campaigns, it's not just to persuade you that mainstream media journalists are liars, let's say. It's to persuade you that there's so many different conflicting accounts out there of anything, of any topic, that there is no such thing as truth. There is no such thing as truth. This person says this, that person says this, and the idea is to bombard your average consumer of information, just a normal person. You bombard them with so many wildly different stories and accounts of the same issue that they end up throwing their hands up in the air and saying, you know what, forget it. Maybe there isn't such a thing as the truth. Maybe there isn't such a thing as facts. I don't want to have anything to do with it. And that's very dangerous, because we've seen in history that the moment you have a society throw up its hands and say, you know what, this is chaos and I don't even know what to make of it anymore, they become extremely vulnerable to being co-opted by authoritarian regimes. So I really feel that this is a hugely important moment. We need to get it right. We need to be on our A game, but the public also needs to really commit to putting their faith in us and to supporting us and to supporting facts.
And double check before you forward like a message on WhatsApp.
No, don't forward messages on WhatsApp. unless they're literally from your best friend being like, I had a baby last night and you recognize her in the picture. Do not also on Twitter, on any social media, if you don't personally know the source of the information, never retweet it. Don't go there. Just don't do it, because it can look incredibly sophisticated, incredibly believable, incredibly compelling, and it can be made up. And it can be even worse than just someone making it up. It can be a deliberate part of a misinformation campaign. So don't share anything if you're not 100% sure of the source.
And it'd be also interesting to talk, Clarissa, about the issue of sexism, misogyny. You recently wrote an article in a magazine about that, and in your book, there are several passages where you describe situations and you talk about, things that were said or remarks that were made precisely because you are a woman. And in this article, you talk about the time when you were expecting your first child, and that, the minute you mentioned that you were pregnant, immediately, people would assume that you were going to do something else, that you were not going to work as a conflict reporter anymore. But on the other hand, at the same time, if it was a male colleague, as you point out, the whole attitude probably would be quite different.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so, I think it's really important that people understand that we've come huge length or distance, I should say, on this issue. When I was starting out my career, the things people would say to young women in war zones were kind of, they wouldn't be accepted nowadays, let alone when Christiane Amanpour was covering Yugoslavia back in the 90s. We now see a lot of women doing this work, a lot of women covering conflict, and not just covering it, but excelling, winning awards, doing incredibly important and powerful reporting. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we understand that I do not believe there is a glass ceiling for women any longer in this industry. I don't think women face discrimination in terms of being given assignments in the field and in hostile environments. But what still exists, and it's much more subtle, but still very pervasive, is this insidious misogyny and assumptions, let's say, that are made about women and particularly about mothers as opposed to men. And depending on where you are in the world, you're going to also run into just some flagrant instances of, borderline sexual assault or certainly misogyny, whatever it might be. So I have always found that it's like a bit of a tightrope how you respond to this, because if you push back too hard, you're considered to be bitchy or aggressive or pushy or chippy. But if you don't push back at all, then you're just pathetic and you're getting steamrolled over. So how do you deal with these situations? I think over the years, I've learned to try to diffuse them with humor or grace or to distract and I think as women, we're always coming up with all these different ways to allow men to save face while at the same time making it clear that you're not interested in that, or you don't think that's appropriate, or that's not going to happen, whatever it may be. And I still think that's the way to go, because I still think if there's a way to rebuke people while allowing them to save face, it's going to make your life easier. The minute you are in a sort of conflict with someone or you've embarrassed them in some way by calling them out, it can make your life more difficult. And I hate to say that because it sounds sort of wimpy, but certainly what I have found on the road and in the field, you kind of need to be able to get on with everyone. You have so many bigger crises and issues that you're dealing with in the field, that something like of this nature, if you are at least feeling that you have it under control, it's usually not in your interest to kind of escalate it.
Still on the topic of misogyny, There is a passage in your book, and as I was reading it, I was, feeling restless, and I have to say, becoming slightly infuriated, to say the least. And I think you know which passage I'm talking about. And I'm not going to spoil anything. Just tell us about the time when you met a certain guest at a dinner party in Russia.
Yeah, so I went to this very small dinner party. There were about 8 of us there, and the guest of honor was Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, who's the late Middle Eastern dictator Muammar Gaddafi's son. He was sort of the heir apparent at that stage. And he ignored me the whole way through the dinner. And then we got into a car to go to, even though I was the only person at the dinner who'd lived in the Middle East, who spoke some Arabic, who knew about the region, but okay, fine. He ignored me. And then we get into this car to go to a nightclub, and he turns around to me, and out of nowhere, he doesn't even try to chat me up or flirt with me or pay me a compliment, nothing. He just lunges at me and tries to, as the Brits say, snog me. Without even there's just nothing. He just sort of moaned baby and then started trying to kiss me. So I obviously pushed him off. And this is a classic example of what I'm talking about. I diffused it with humor. Ha ha. Oh, no. And then he kept persisting. Oh, ha ha. I'm a Western journalist. You don't want to try to kiss me. This is silly. Oh, ha ha. And on. And he kept pushing himself on me. And so finally I cursed at him in Arabic. I called him a son of a lady of the night, which is a sort of common curse in Arabic. And I did have this brief moment of wondering if I was going to end up sort of in little pieces in a ditch somewhere. But he actually seemed to find it tremendously charming or something. And, by the end of the night, I got rid of him. It was fine. I actually, ironically, was more insulted. And I don't know, this probably says more about me than anything else. I was more insulted by the way in which he dismissed me at the dinner. That was more offensive to me than him just being really drunk and trying to kiss me. I hated the way I was constantly dismissed at the dinner. And, what did I do about it? Nothing. But then 13 years later, I get to put it in my book. And so revenge is a dish best served cold sometimes.
Another interesting thing as well, Clarissa, and you often talk about this, is that quite often people assume because you are a woman, it must be so much more dangerous and complicated to report from conflict zones, for instance, to work as a war correspondent. And also because, you are always traveling, and sometimes you have to work, in conservative areas, conservative countries, and you have to dress appropriately, and people see those images and immediately they assume, oh, that must be also very difficult for her to be able to do her job. But actually, that is not really the case, is it?
No, I've always viewed being a woman as being as an asset. And why do I view it as an asset? Well, first of all, in conservative countries, I can get access to 50% of the population that my male colleagues can't even see or talk to or visit with or interview. And that's pretty huge as far as I'm concerned. And I'm allowed to interview the men as well. You sort of enjoy, as a female Western reporter, you enjoy this weird space, which has been called in Afghanistan, sometimes you're called, you're an honorary man, right? You're not a man, so you're still treated with a slightly gentle touch or with deference, and you still have access to the women, but you can also sit with the men. So I view that as a tremendous opportunity. And I think that my reporting definitely has benefited from being able to talk to women, seeing how they understand a conflict or a place. And invariably, they're a source of huge amounts of information, but they also have a different perspective on war, usually. Not only that, I can put on an abaya and cover my hair or cover my face with a niqab and basically go under the radar and disappear, it can be useful if I'm trying to go undercover, but it also can be useful in any situation where I don't want to be the story, where I don't want to be at a protest and have a huge group of people around me being like, look, it's a Western journalist. I'd like to melt into the background if I can and observe the swell of the scene as it's evolving organically without my interference in it. So, and I think, there's times as well where you're viewed as more of a curiosity or an oddity than you are as a threat. And sometimes, Western males are really regarded as a threat. They're mercenaries, they're spies, they're soldiers, they're whatever in the eyes of some people. Whereas you're less likely to contend with that as a woman. I don't want to overly glamorize it because obviously you're facing all kinds of sexism on a regular basis. But I think that the benefits outweigh the downsides.
There's one story that you told me when we first met. Is that about the time that you were kidnapped in Ukraine?
Yeah.
And that was scary. I mean, because people would think that, of course, when you are in a conflict zone being shot at, that's the scariest bit. But also that situation as a woman, you felt a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, nothing happened. It just was a moment as I was this man was taking my jewelry off of me and he was doing my earring, which is a very intimate gesture. And then he was touching my body and my bottom because he was emptying my pockets. And there was just a moment of fear or panic that I was going to be sexually assaulted. And I wasn't, and it was okay. But it was a reminder that, of course, we are vulnerable as women. And I have definitely seen female colleagues of mine who have been assaulted in the field. And there are women living all over the world who are being assaulted on a regular basis as well. So I don't want to downplay the challenges and the fact that we really need to do much better. And we really do face some tough circumstances. But for the most part, I have been very fortunate and I have not had to deal too much with that threat.
Would you say, because by the end of the book, you say that, the entire story behind the book is very interesting because you say that you started writing this book as a love letter to your son. And then it became a love letter to journalism, which is, you can feel that as you read the book. But would you say that also motherhood changed the way you see stories, the way you approach stories?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. Motherhood, look, it's a very subjective thing, right? And no two mothers probably feel exactly the same way. For me, I found that I'm much more emotionally porous, much more sensitive to the suffering, particularly of children, the sacrifices that I see of mothers. I feel always I have been moved by the suffering of children, for example. Now I find it borderline unbearable to see a child suffer. And so I hope that makes its way into my reporting. I hope that adds compassion and urgency. And I hope it influences the kinds of stories that I tell. Because I do think it's important. And I think sometimes we tend to dismiss it as being it's emotional or it's sentimental or, and I think that's because we've always seen war coverage in very male terms and in very male language, because that's what we had to do to be in a man's world. And I'm excited that we're living, more broadly speaking, in a time where there is a greater diversity of voices telling stories. I think that makes it much more vibrant, much more interesting. And I would like to see mothers continuing to tell stories of conflict and war. I think they do have a different perspective. And I've even said in the past that I have wondered to myself, if we had more mothers covering war, whether we wouldn't have so much war. So that's how I see it.
It's fascinating, this journey that you went through. And as the title of your book says, an education of a journalist, there is a learning curve. And I felt as I was reading your book that I was learning with you. And, when you started out, for instance, you had just graduated from Yale and 9/11 had just happened, and that had a huge impact on your life and on your decision to become a journalist. And as we talked about before, you wanted to build bridges, create those connections, and also tell those human stories. But then later on, particularly in Syria, there was a moment of almost like frustration, if I can say so, because you were witnessing the human tragedy, the horror of what was going on, and you were close to what was going on the ground, and you were trying to bring those stories, tell those stories to the world. But at some point, the West was pretty much failing in Syria, and it seemed like nobody was really listening. But then there's so much a journalist can do, even in situations like that. So tell us about that. How did you reconcile those internal conflicts as well, Clarissa? How did you came to the conclusion that, there's so much, you talk about this in your book, there's so much a journalist can do, even in situations like that?
Yeah. So I think, you're absolutely right that in Syria, that was the moment where I realized that I can't change the world. And it was a brutal wake-up call, because it was like, what do you mean I can't do anything to help these people when I'm seeing what's happening and I know the atrocities and I'm capturing them on camera and I'm sharing them with an international audience and I'm speaking at the United Nations? And how is it possible that none of this testimony, that none of these stories can do anything to move people to help the Syrian people? And then I had a sort of epiphany where I realized that it's not my job to solve the problem. My job is to shine a light on the problem, to illuminate it, to tell the stories of those experiencing it, to give a voice to people who might not otherwise have a voice, to collect information about war crimes or whatever atrocities may be transpiring. That's my job. My job is to illuminate the problem, not to solve it. And I think once I understood my role in a much more humble prism, it was so much easier to accept the fact that, yeah, I couldn't change the world, but that's okay. I'm not supposed to change the world. I'm one journalist. And even if it was all of us journalists, occasionally you will participate in a story that does have a huge impact. But we also have to appreciate that as individuals, you can get a little caught up in hubris and this idea that you can make the difference. And there are really big forces at work out there in the world. And that's okay. Your job is not to trump all of those and be able to implement what you think is the best solution. Your job is just to tell the story, to keep telling it, to tell it as best you can. And there are other people whose job it is to deal with the consequences.
And what about the whole discussion around neutrality and activism and the whole, there's a whole debate around that?
It's hard for the reason that we discussed before, which is the more you're emotionally invested, the better your work is. The more you care, the more compelling the story is. So how do you balance that with the fact that you can't be too emotionally invested, that you're a journalist, not an activist? How do you walk that tightrope? And I think I don't have all the answers, except that there has to be an understanding that if you're covering conflict, you are naturally going to have some sympathy for the side of the conflict that you are covering, because you're living with these people and watching them die. And, it's normal if you're a human being. Now, that means that you have to have someone covering the other side of the conflict too, if you're a news organization, because then you do sort of balance it out. But I can't sort of stand there after what I've seen in Syria and say, on the one hand this, on the other hand Bashar al-Assad that. No, but for me it's a false equivalence. And so I accept the fact that on that story, I am biased. I don't really see it as being biased, though. I see it as being truthful, not neutral. This is something that Christiana's talked about as well, truthful, not neutral. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But again, I think we also have to be careful about staying within the realms of what the facts tell us and not just letting ourselves be carried away by a sort of an emotion. But I think for the most part, journalists do a pretty good job of that.
One last question about freelancers, because you worked as a freelancer at some point as well. But it can be pretty challenging. You have your friend Austin Tice, who's still missing. So what is the responsibility?
The bottom line is, when you're a freelancer, no one is protecting you. And in Syria, we saw freelancers going into one of the most dangerous conflicts, probably the most dangerous conflict I've ever covered. They had no insurance, they had no body armor, they didn't speak any Arabic, they had never done a hostile environments course, and they had no one on the phone every day in the form of an editor telling them, don't do that, that's stupid, that's too dangerous, you need to leave now, or whatever it might be. So, how on earth is that sensible or is that sustainable? I mean, you're, of course, creating opportunity for there to be hugely dangerous moments. And the problem is, in the case of Syria, for example, what these editors would do would be like, oh, we're not going to take any responsibility for you. But if you're in the front line and you get some crazy, amazing video of a gun battle, yeah, I'll buy it from you. But I won't take responsibility for you. I won't look out for you. And that is wrong. I think that's wrong. And I think we learned a lot from Syria. We learned a lot from far too many freelancers in Syria who were either kidnapped or killed. And we need to do better by our freelance colleagues. We need to support them more. We need to make sure they get the support that they need.
What would you say, Clarissa, to someone, because the other day I just mentioned that I was going to interview you, and the comment that I heard was, she's so brave. She's so awesome.
Well, awesome I'll take. No, I'm kidding. I'm not that brave. I really, really, genuinely am not. I get very frightened in scary situations. I hate being in a place where bullets are whizzing over my head. I really try to avoid that kind of active, kinetic frontline situation. I just feel, I guess it's a mixture of a love of adventure and the camaraderie that you have in the field, both with your team and with people you meet. And then this sense of, I love trying to get to places that other people can't get to and telling the stories of the people who are living there.
Can it be an addiction for some people, do you think?
I think it can, especially when you're younger. And I also think even if it's not an addiction, it just becomes very difficult to go back to normal life. You know, I mean, I couldn't imagine going into an office at 9 a.m. and wearing a suit and being very presentable and watching my language and, I mean, maybe for a couple of weeks, but no.
Not only you are brave, but also very intelligent. You speak 7 languages.
Well, I speak at very different levels. And I do keep telling people that. They're like, oh, you're a linguistic miracle. No, I speak French and Italian well. I speak Russian and Arabic conversationally. I speak basic Mandarin. And because of my French and Italian, I can understand Spanish and speak some Spanish. But it's not, yeah.
Just that. Very simple. So Clarissa, here at 1 Million Voices, we always talk about organizations that are making a difference in the world. And today you have selected 2 charities that are very close to your heart. So let's start with the first one. Tell us about the organization that you have selected and the work that they do as well.
So I have selected INARA. INARA is a charity that is founded and run by an incredible woman. She also happens to be a dear friend of mine and my colleague at CNN, Arwa Damon. And basically what INARA does is it gives children who have been injured in conflict zones top medical care, top medical treatment. And whether that involves getting them out of the conflict zone, hooking them up with the best surgeons, rehabilitation, whatever it is, INARA is able to find the best possible treatment and care for these children. And for me personally, as a mother, as a human, and just having traveled for all these years in some terrible places, nothing could be more important and more beautiful than trying to, at least in some way, make up to the youngest victims of war some of the damage so that they can hopefully go on to have a better life. I really feel like it's our responsibility as human beings to do everything we can to support these children. And that is what Arwa does 1,000 times over. And because it's Arwa, I know that there's none of the stuff you might deal with other charities with large overheads and funds not being spent well. Like every penny goes to these kids and getting them the best possible care.
There is nothing that compares to the emotions of watching just how transformative providing these children with medical assistance is. The impact is not just evident on how they live their lives, but also how their parents are then able to live their lives. And I truly believe that it is fundamentally our humanitarian responsibility to help the most vulnerable in their most desperate time of need in any way we can.
And you also chose another organization that is doing a fantastic job as well. So tell us about that, Clarissa.
So the other organization I chose, and again, I'm a little biased here because I'm actually an ambassador for this organization, is Women for Women International. And essentially, they're doing extraordinary work around the world, empowering women in conflict zones, giving them the tools to improve their economic outlook, to participate in the peace process and wherever it is that they live. And this is so hugely essential because, as any of us who have covered war know, there's huge amount of untapped potential in women across the world. And it's wonderful to see a charity like this one, which really is all about empowering and nurturing those women.
We are stronger together. We are strong together. We are stronger together.
Thank you so much, Clarissa, for taking the time to talk to us here today. It was really great speaking with you. It was fascinating to learn more details about your story and also to talk about your book. Thank you also for sharing the information about INARA and Women for Women. We invite everyone to visit their websites and get involved. But, this has been a real treat. Thank you so much, Clarissa.
Thank you so much, Catia. I've loved our conversation.
Thank
Ciao.
you.
Bye.
If you enjoyed watching this interview, don't forget to leave your comment, share the link, and subscribe to the channel. You can also follow us on social media. This is a very exciting moment for the 1 Million Voices project as we are just starting out. So I invite everyone to join us. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.